It is March 18th, and 142 years ago today, Morgan Seth Earp, younger brother of Wyatt Earp, was shot in the back while playing pool at Campbell and Hatch's Saloon and Billiard Parlor in Tombstone, Arizona. The murder of Morgan Earp is a central part of one of the most famous stories of the American Wild West, and yet we know almost nothing about the life of Morgan Earp, whose story was not nearly as well recorded as that of his more famous brother. In fact, were it not for his more famous brother, the whole life of Morgan Earp might have become forgotten history. The saga of the Earps is certainly well recognized in America. At least 20 movies have featured or included Wyatt Earp, as well as a television series, The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp, which ran for 225 episodes between 1955 and 1961. Many dozens of books have been written about the Earps, including books authored by Wyatt Earp himself, as well as his common-law wife, Josephine. Moreover, various stories about the lives of the Earps were published in many newspapers at the time, and their notorious feud in Tombstone was reported throughout the nation. And yet there's still a great deal of mystery and disagreement regarding the lives of the Earp brothers, including a brother who was central to the conflict that would make the Earps famous. Earp historian Lee A. Silva wrote on HistoryNet in 2018, "Little is known about Morgan Seth Earp, as he was never well known enough to create much newspaper ink." Morgan Earp was the fifth of 6 sons of Nicholas Porter Nick Earp. Nicholas Earp, described by Silva as irascible and by Earp historian Alan Barra as a wheat, corn, and tobacco farmer, storekeeper, constable, cooper, justice of the peace, wagon master, judge, and bootlegger, to name just a few of his occupations, moved the family around quite a lot. Wyatt, at age 13, was just 3 years older than Morgan, and both were too young to enlist when the 3 older brothers, Newton, James, and Virgil, went to serve the Union Army in the U.S. Civil War. It isn't clear exactly how close Wyatt and Morgan became working on the farm while their brothers fought in the war, but historian Roger J. noted in 2006 that the 2 brothers had apparently gone into business together by 1872, when both were arrested twice for either patronizing or possibly helping to operate a house of ill fame in Peoria, Illinois. Despite the local crackdown on this den of iniquity, Silva notes that in those days prostitution was often considered no less moral than, say, the banking business. While there is a much more complex newspaper record of Wyatt's exploits, Morgan's activities are relatively less known. The Butte, Montana Miner noted that he had been appointed a town policeman there in 1879. It isn't clear whether he, like his more famous brother, had been a law enforcement officer previous to that. Per usual, it is somewhat difficult to tease out fact from legend in stories of the Wild West, but author Charles Bennett noted on the website officer.com the legend that Morgan had killed famous lawman/outlaw William L. Billy Brooks in a gunfight in Butte, despite the fact that Brooks is known to have been lynched for rustling in Kansas in 1874. By 1880, Morgan moved to Tombstone. Tombstone had only been founded the previous year, near the site of a silver discovery. The silver mines had produced wealth in a fast-growing city, rife with opportunity. Earp brothers James, Virgil, Wyatt, and Warren had all come to the town. The Earps were involved in multiple businesses, including both mining interests and agricultural land. Wyatt had a faro concession at a local saloon, but they were also lawmen. Virgil was at times a deputy U.S. Marshal, a town marshal, and a Tombstone chief of police. Wyatt was a deputy county sheriff and a detective for Wells Fargo. The rest of the brothers, including Morgan, often operated as special deputies. Morgan was also a messenger, generally meaning a stagecoach guard for Wells Fargo. The payrolls of the mines meant that the stagecoaches needed security. Virgil said in an 1882 interview that the first stage that went out of Prescott towards Tombstone was robbed. Robberies were frequent. But Wyatt and then Morgan must have done a good job, because Virgil said that while his brothers were shotgun messengers, no box was lost or any trouble experienced. As soon as my brother quit, the cowboys began robbing the stages. The cowboys were a loosely connected group of outlaws, the term cowboy itself generally meaning a cattle rustler at the time. Rustling was a lucrative business near Tombstone, given the demands to feed its growing population, but the cowboys certainly involved themselves in other crimes as well, and that quickly placed them at odds with the Earps. Silva writes, After officials carved Cochise County out of Pima County in February 1881, its new sheriff, Johnny Behan, was openly in cahoots with the cowboys, and thus the Earps were the only law enforcement in and around Tombstone. This would lead to a feud that included Morgan. There were many confrontations between the two camps, a feud that was possibly exacerbated because the cowboys were mostly Southerners and Democrats, while the Earps represented a mostly Northern and Republican town elite. The extent to which Morgan participated in the conflict is not fully documented, but Virgil and Wyatt both later testified that Morgan had been part of a posse that had helped an army captain track down some stolen army mules to two members of the cowboys. Wyatt later said, "Captain Hearst cautioned me and my brothers, Virgil and Morgan, to look out for those men, as they had made some threats against our lives." The following October, the Arizona Weekly Citizen reported that Morgan and Virgil had helped Wyatt track down cowboys after the shooting of Tombstone Town Marshal Fred White. The shooting was eventually ruled to be accidental, but was said to have resulted in further threats against the Earps by cowboys. Later, Wyatt reported that cowboy Frank McClowry directly threatened Morgan after two cowboys were arrested for a stage robbery. This would lead to one of the most famous confrontations in Wild West history, the October 26, 1881, gunfight at the OK Corral. Despite the name, the gunfight, which involved Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and Wyatt's friend John Henry Doc Holliday, and cowboys Billy Claiborne, brothers Ike and Billy Clanton, and brothers Frank and Tom McClowry, actually occurred in an alley behind the OK Corral in Tombstone. The confrontation followed several tense exchanges between Ike Clanton, the Earps, and Doc Holliday, and occurred after Sheriff Behan tried unsuccessfully to disarm both parties. The Earps, led by Virgil, the town marshal, confronted the five men in order to enforce a town ordinance against carrying firearms. In the famous gunfight, Virgil was wounded in the calf, and Morgan shot through the shoulder. Frank and Tom McClowry and Billy Clanton were all killed. The Arizona Weekly Citizen reported Billy Clanton had shot at Morgan Earp, the ball passing through the point of the left shoulder blade across his back, just grazing the backbone and coming out at the shoulder, the ball remaining inside his shirt. He fell to the ground, but in an instant gathered himself and, raising in a sitting position, fired at Frank McClowry as he crossed Fremont Street. And at the same instant, Doc Holliday shot at him, both balls taking effect, either of which would have proved fatal. The paper wrote that the firing altogether didn't occupy more than 25 seconds, during which time fully 30 shots were fired. The Tombstone Nugget wrote, "The 26th of October, 1881, will always be marked as one of the crimson days in the annals of Tombstone, a day when blood flowed as water and human life was held as a shuttlecock." The famous fight has been portrayed on film many times, but actually the exact course of events remains controversial. The town was deeply divided, and Ike Clanton filed murder charges against the Earps and Holliday. There was no formal trial. Rather, there was a preliminary hearing by Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer. The hearing took weeks and included the testimony of 30 witnesses. Some witnesses argued that the Earps had been spoiling for a fight, others that it was Ike Clanton. At significant issue was who had fired first, with witnesses for the prosecution testifying that Wyatt had begun shooting before the 5 men had had a chance to respond when Virgil told them to throw down their arms. Another claimed that Morgan had shot first. Virgil testified that Frank McClowry and Billy Clanton drew their six-shooters and commenced to cock them as soon as he ordered them to disarm. Wyatt testified that Billy Clanton shot first. After all the conflicting testimony, Spicer ruled for the defense, saying there was not enough evidence to justify a trial. He wrote, "I cannot resist the conclusion that the defendants were fully justified in committing these homicides." Public opinion was as divided as the town. Professor Douglas O. Linder of the University of Missouri at Kansas City opined, after listening to weeks of testimony, Judge Spicer gave his answer, but whether his answer was the right one remained a subject of considerable debate long after the silver mines that gave birth to Tombstone, Arizona, had vanished. Clearly, the cowboys were not satisfied. On December 26th, there was an attempt to assassinate Virgil. James would tell a Los Angeles paper he was coming out of the Oriental Saloon to go home when 3 double-barreled shotguns filled with buckshot were fired at him. It is not known who did it. Virgil lost the use of his left arm. Following the assassination attempt, Wyatt was deputized as a deputy U.S. Marshal, tasked with putting an end to the cowboys' crimes. In a letter to the Boston Evening Transcript, Tombstone resident Clara Spaulding Brown wrote that, although the threats were plentiful, no further demonstrations of hatred and of revenge were made again until Saturday evening, March 18th. James told the newspaper that the Earp brothers had been to hear the Lindengard troupe, and on coming away, friends told them to be on the lookout. They went into a saloon, and Morgan Earp, with Bob Hatches and the proprietor and several others, commenced playing pool. Morgan went around to the end of the billiard table and, turning his back to a glass door, bent down to play, when the fatal shots were fired from the outside. One struck him in the back and came out through his stomach. Another hit him in the spine and, going through him, struck another man in the leg. Morgan was examined by 3 different doctors, but his wounds were mortal. He died within the hour. There are several different stories about what he said after being wounded, but all seem to agree that he said, "I've played my last round of pool." By some accounts, he hung on past midnight to die on the 19th, Wyatt's 34th birthday. Morgan Earp was just 30 years old. The Arizona Daily Star wrote of him, "Morgan, who was killed on Saturday last, was the handsomest of the brothers, and perhaps the most reckless, for at times it required the combined efforts of all the others to keep him in check when he got mad." The Sacramento Union wrote, "So the roughs of Tombstone have succeeded in murdering brave Morgan Earp at last. They had to assassinate him by shooting through a window, for none of them had the pluck to face him in a fair fight. The ruffians are all cowards when put to the test." At the coroner's inquest, Marietta Spence, wife of cowboy Peter Spence, implicated her husband, along with Frank Stillwell, who had once been a deputy town sheriff, and 3 other men in the murder, testifying, "Spence didn't tell me so, but I know he killed Morgan Earp." The coroner's jury concluded that Morgan's death was caused, as they believe, from the effect of a gunshot or pistol wound by Peter Spence, Frank Stillwell, one John Doe Freeze, an Indian called Charlie, and another Indian, name unknown. But at a preliminary hearing, the testimony of Marietta was excluded as hearsay, and the charges were dismissed. Not trusting the law to punish the men who had shot their brothers, Wyatt and Warren, along with Holliday and others, would take matters into their own hands as a federal posse hunting down the cowboys. The first to die was Frank Stillwell, shot by Wyatt after apparently trying to lie in wait to kill Virgil as he boarded a train. When lawmen described Stillwell's body as the worst shot-up man I ever saw. At least 3 more cowboys were killed in the Vendetta ride. The Arizona Daily Star opined that the conflict between the Earps and the cowboys was the natural result of a quarrel between desperate men in a land where murder was rife and justice comparatively unknown. No one ever faced trial for shooting Virgil or Morgan Earp, and in fact the exact perpetrators are still unknown, although theories abound. There was never a jury trial for the death of the McClowrys and Billy Clanton in the gunfight at the OK Corral, and while there was a warrant issued for Wyatt's posse for the death of Frank Stillwell, they escaped to Colorado, where the governor refused to extradite them. In the end, the brutal Cochise County War resulted in no jury trials, no criminal convictions, justice comparatively unknown, and the whole issue simply seemed to fade away as the silver mines closed and Tombstone lost its luster. Morgan's remains were sent back to California, where he was buried by his parents. We still know so little about him for being so central to the conflict. Unlike others involved, he didn't live long enough to write a memoir, never got to tell his side of the story. Silva noted that as he kept no diaries, exactly what motivated him in his short life will forever remain a mystery. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.